Hi there, my name is Marley and welcome to my channel. Today I'm going to be finally filming my August wrap up, so talking about all of the books that I read during the month. And I managed to read 8 books this month, so pretty good. Not my best month, not the worst. Most of these books I did read in vlogs, so I will mention those and link them below and link them above if you want to watch. But as always, I'm going to talk about the books in the order from my least favorite book to my favorite, so you'll want to stick around to the end to see those. So first of all, we are starting out with a book that I gave 3 stars, and that was Tower of Dawn by Sarah J. Maas. If you are not familiar with Sarah J. Maas, she wrote the series Throne of Glass, and this is the 6th book in the series, and it's actually kind of like a little side story because it is not focusing on our main character Selena. It's actually focusing on one of the other main characters, Kale, and it's kind of interesting because it takes place during the same timeline that the previous book did, Empire of Storms. It's just focusing on another character and what they were going through at that same timeline. So I was not super excited to read this book just because it was, not following our main character. It was following Kale, who can be like a little bit on the boring side, I have to admit. But this book ended up being, I would say, not as bad as I thought. A little tiny bit of spoilers for the series, but Kale was like the guard of the castle in the series. He's like the head guard, sorry. And he ends up getting this really crazy injury where basically he cannot walk due to events that happened in the other books. So him and this character Nezrin end up going to this other kingdom that has really powerful healers, so he can get healed there and then eventually team back up with Selena, our main character, and like deal with the rest of the issues going on. While we're there, he meets Irene, who is like the head healer that is assigned to him. And it was interesting because we actually have seen Irene before in the Assassin's, what was that book called? Assassin's Blade, which was a short story collection for Throne of Glass. Irene was actually featured in that series. So it has been cool to like see all the little side characters featured in those short stories come into the main series now. So the 3 points of views we had during the book were Kale, Nezrin, and Irene. And I have to say, I actually quite liked the chapters that were from Kale and Irene's point of view, especially when it came to the romantic elements that were happening in their chapters. Nezrin's chapters were very, very boring to me and were like the worst part of the book for me that I did not enjoy. So that's why I had to be a 3-star. Like, if you guys have watched other videos of mine where I talk about the Throne of Glass series, I'm not loving the series that much. So it's kind of typical for me to give a book 3 stars. But I did end up feeling chills like in the last chapter, which really like saved it from being any lower. There definitely were just like good elements in it. I just wish Sarah J. Maas like cut out so many things that just I feel are not needed. So yeah, now I just have the final book in the series, and then I will be done. This next book I gave 3.5 stars, and I read it for the Enneagram Readathon at the beginning of the month. So this was like a really long time ago. I think this was the first book I read this month. And it is The Hunting Party by Lucy Foley. So this is a thriller following this group of friends that ends up going away together on this sort of like camping trip during New Year's Eve, so during the winter. Weird time to camp, but they did it. It's a tradition, I guess. A lot of them are sort of estranged and have secrets that they're keeping from each other and stuff like that, and sort of have suspicious things going on. In the meantime, we're seeing like a flash forward where we know that someone on this trip ends up dead. And the whole story is leading up to that and seeing which of these guests ends up dead and obviously who kills them. Very similar to The Guest List. If you read that book by Lucy Foley, that was like a bestseller last year. Very similar setup, very similar way that she tells the story with the flash forwards and with having point of views from multiple characters, and then also kind of having flashbacks as well as you get to know these characters and like how they met back in college and stuff like that. I 100% guessed the twist. There was one point that it sort of tricked me, but then I did end up being correct. So not the the most amazing thriller. I do like Lucy Foley's writing, and I do kind of like her formula because I just love, I've learned recently they're called closed door mysteries, where they're like in an isolated setting trying to figure out who the killer is. And I just like that whole vibe of like a group of friends go somewhere and then bad things happen. So if you like those tropes, you would probably still like this, but it is very predictable. So I wouldn't overly recommend this, like it's not a standout, but if you want just kind of like a fun basic thriller, here you go. The next book I read was The Song of Achilles, and I give this one 4 out of 5 stars. And I actually read it in a vlog where I was reading popular retelling books, and this is also by Madeline Miller, I should say. So probably everyone has heard of this book. For some reason it is just blowing up this year, mostly due to TikTok. So I was really excited for it. I gave into the hype. I was like, this is gonna be great. People say it's so like romantic and cute, but then it's also like really heartbreaking. I gave it 4 stars. Obviously I did enjoy it, but I was a little bit let down, unfortunately. If you guys aren't familiar with the premise, it is following Achilles and Patroclus, and it is a retelling of the Iliad, which is like this classic Greek mythology book. It has to do with like Helen of Troy and like the wars and the Trojan horse and, you know, all those sorts of things that you always hear about. But Madeline Miller did this retelling in an interesting way where we were following Patroclus, who is this kind of nobody guy who ends up befriending Achilles, and they actually end up falling in love. That is the romance, and Achilles is destined to be like the greatest warrior of all time. So it's kind of just like building up to that, like what is he gonna do? There is the famous war that goes on that they fight in. If you know the legends, you know a little bit more about it, but I don't want to spoil. So I definitely recommend this if you are into Greek mythology. There's a lot of stuff in there that I think you would enjoy. Also, if you like tragedy and like tragic romances. Unfortunately, the part that I didn't enjoy very much was sort of the middle, when we're dealing with so much of the war and the battles. I just don't really like action that much. I like a bit of action, obviously, and like my fantasy and my thrillers, but it was just like a little too much, and then the romance got kind of dropped off to the side, which is what really had me interested at the beginning. The ending, I felt there were like beautiful aspects to it, but it also again kind of like dragged. So it just wasn't the perfect book for me, and that's why I was slightly disappointed, but I still think it was a good book and worth the read, especially if you're into like history and mythology and stuff like that. Speaking of Greek mythology, I also read Lore by Alexandra Bracken, which I just feel like I've talked about a bunch on my channel lately, but this is following this girl whose name is Lore, and she is a part of this ancient bloodline that hunts gods every Agon, and the Agon is when this group of gods was like punished by Zeus and they all become human for the week, and so they're able to be killed and have their powers transferred to someone else. So there are these ancient families that always hunt down the gods, and a lot of them have actually replaced the gods at this point. I think at the beginning of the book there's just Athena, Artemis, and Apollo that have not been replaced at this point. So Lore is from that sort of upbringing, but she has tried to escape that life when like her whole family was slaughtered. So she's trying to just kind of get away from that, and then she just gets dragged back into it during this Agon when Athena comes to her asking for help as one of the only remaining gods, as I just said. And there is a lot of action. It's a pretty like bloody, gory book for like a YA. It's not like that gory, but considering like that it's YA, there's a pretty cute romance. And again, I would pretty much only recommend this if you are into the Greek mythology sort of stuff, because as I've said, there are a lot of gods featured in this book and just like cool fantasy stuff. And in this one, the action did not bother me. So I guess it's just kind of like I'm picky with it. During the moment, I did really enjoy it. However, now that weeks have passed, I don't overly feel like it's gonna stick with me that much. But definitely go check out my vlog where I was talking more about it in the moment, because I know I was really into it and I flew through it. I think maybe because it's a standalone, like I was able to like leave the characters behind. Like I'm not super invested in this anymore, but it was a really good time while reading it, and I think the book is really beautiful physically. So yeah, 4 to 5 stars. Then we have Any Way the Wind Blows by Rainbow Rowell, which I also read for the Enneagram Readathon. This is the 3rd book in the Carry On series, which is a little YA fantasy series following Simon Snow and Baz. Simon is basically the chosen one type of character in this world of mages, and Baz is his grumpy roommate, and at the beginning of the series they hate each other. It's kind of like a Harry Potter and Draco Malfoy dynamic, I like to say, and they eventually fall in love. And I highly recommend the first book. The first book will always be one of my favorite books. I think this is truly enemies to lovers. Like, they want to kill each other and then they grow to love each other. This 3rd book was not perfect to me, hence the 4-star rating, but I feel like with the nostalgic elements and a lot of those same fun elements that you love from earlier in the series, it was still very enjoyable. I do feel like it was a little too long, a little too dragged out in certain areas, and the parts that I enjoyed the most were when we had like all of our main characters back together following this one storyline that was a little bit reminiscent of the first book. So yeah, I would overall recommend this series, but I even think the first one could stand alone if you just want to check that one out and see how you like it. But yeah, I was definitely a little bit sad to see this series come to a close, but at the same time, I'm glad that it did. We can move on now. Next up, I read Dial A for Aunties by Jessie Q. Sutanto. And in this book, it was a super fun book, and it follows our main character, who I forget her name now, but she is a wedding photographer and has this sort of wedding business that she does with her mom and her aunties. She is single, so her aunties, you know, kind of interfere with her life a little bit and end up setting her up on this blind date. She goes, it is not a good date, and the guy ends up dead. She ends up killing him. And so then she brings the body back to her mom and her aunties, and she's like, help me. And it's just this big crazy, and I mean crazy, story of her and the aunties trying to hide the body and get away with murder essentially, while trying to put on this huge wedding at this like huge venue. It's being made into a Netflix movie, and I can see why, because it's literally perfect for a movie, one of those crazy rom-coms that's super fun but also romantic, as there is a love story involved as well, and they were really cute. It's not a huge part of it, like don't go into it thinking it's gonna focus on the romance too much. It really is mostly focused on this plot with the crazy wedding, dead body stuff, but it was just so hilarious. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. Our main character is also Chinese Indonesian, which if you're interested in like hearing more about that culture and stuff, I found that really valuable. Yeah, just a really great book. I haven't seen too many people discuss it on BookTube, just a few, so I definitely want to recommend it, because like most of these books are very hyped, but this one I feel is not really that hyped, so definitely check it out, add it to your TBR. It's hilarious. Then we just have our last 2 books, and they are both 5 stars. First of all, there is A Court of Thorns and Roses by Sarah J. Maas. I finally moved on to this series. So far I'd only read Throne of Glass series by her, but I wanted to read A Court of Thorns and Roses because this is the series that everyone loves so much. Obviously I've only read the first book so far, but I 100% see why people love this, because yeah, I give it 5 stars. If you guys are not familiar with it, it follows this girl, Feyre, who is the youngest daughter of 3, and she basically has to take care of her whole family. When her mom dies, her dad is disabled, and then her sisters are like basically useless. So it's kind of like a Katniss Everdeen vibe, where she, you know, goes out to the woods, hunts for them, feeds them, whatever. Because they live in like, this doesn't take place in our world. It's not like urban fantasy. It's in like this fantasy world. In this world, there is a fairy realm that is like separate from the mortals, but this fairy ends up coming over to the mortal world, and Feyre ends up shooting it and killing it. Because of that, she has to get punished by one of the fairy kings named Tamlin in the fairy world. And so he comes and he's like, you killed one of my friends, one of my like fairy people, so you're gonna have to come and live with me. Oh, I should also mention it is a loose Beauty and the Beast retelling. She ends up going to live with him in his castle, and there is a, you know, curse that's on his kingdom that obviously she may or may not be the key to breaking it. Beauty and the Beast, you know. She's basically like a prisoner there, but also not really. Like, he lets her do whatever. It is obviously a romance between her and LaFairy, and then it really escalates. Like, the second half just really goes off from there that I can't even like describe it. There is another suitor, like romantic love interest, that enters the picture as well, named Rhysand. It's definitely giving me like love triangle vibes, Vampire Diaries vibes with the love triangle, and it just was such a nostalgic thing for me because back in the day, due to Twilight and everything, like every fantasy book, every YA fantasy book was like this. Like, a human girl comes into this fantasy world, has like a love triangle. For some reason, she's so special and like the chosen one, and that is like totally what this was, and I just really enjoyed it. Definitely is better than Throne of Glass. Yeah, I'm just super excited to continue this series. Rhysand definitely really intrigued me. I don't hate Tamlin yet. Apparently people start to hate him, so I'm very interested to see why that is. Lucian is the best though. The final book to talk about was probably my favorite book of the month, and that was The Maidens by Michaelides. Sorry. So this is a thriller novel. It follows our main character, Mariana, right? So she is a group therapist, and her husband has like died. She's had some like tragedy in her life, of course. She gets a call from her niece that there has been a murder at the niece's college. And so she goes to kind of like comfort her niece, see what's up, and it ends up being this whole like conspiracy going on at the school where it seems like this professor may have killed this girl, and he has this whole sort of like cult surrounding him, like this cult of young girls that all like worship him, and this girl was a part of it. And then these girls keep dying. So obviously it seems like it might be this teacher. Mariana just sort of gets invested in it, especially because her niece, you know, could be in danger. She starts, you know, using her psychology skills and everything to try and figure out what is going on here. It's a pretty short book. I really flew through it, really short chapters, written in a way that is just so interesting. You just want to keep reading. I was pretty surprised by the ending. I did not guess the twist, which I always appreciate that because these days it can be pretty easy to guess. So I really liked that. It does get disturbing though, and there have been quite a few criticisms of this book, and I totally see where they're coming from. Definitely look into those things as well. But for me personally, just because I enjoyed reading it so much and I was surprised by the twist, I had to give it 5 stars. There were a few things about the ending that I didn't totally love, but still had to be the most enjoyable book, the like quickest book I went through this month. So I would highly recommend, and I would highly recommend especially if you were a fan of his previous book, The Silent Patient, as well, as I loved both of them. Okay, so that is the end of the wrap up. Hopefully you enjoyed hearing some of these recommendations. I had a pretty good reading month. Most of these I gave 4 stars or higher. Yay. Please make sure to subscribe, like, and comment, and do all the YouTube things below. Thanks so much for watching, and I will see you in my next video. Bye!